Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Grill presented by Wrap Pro. I am Andy Ortiz, a reporter here at TheWrap and co-host of Wrap Women's Unwrapped podcast. Today, we are here to discuss the beauty of podcasts, how they might just be Hollywood's new goldmine. I am joined by just a slew of beautiful and talented and very intelligent faces, and I am excited to have a conversation with them. First up, we have Becca Tobin. She is an actress and co-host of the Lady Gang podcast. We have Liz Merriweather, who is a showrunner on The Dropout. We have Lee Eisenberg, who is also a showrunner on WeCrashed for Apple TV+. We have Rachel Ghiatta, who is the EVP and head of U.S. content for Audible. We have Steve Ackerman, the EVP and co-head of global podcasts for Sony Music. And finally, we have Will Malnati, founder and CEO of At Will Media. Hello, everyone. Let me inhale because you all have so many titles ahead of you that I just need oxygen right now. But thank you for being here today. How are you, everyone? Genuinely, how are you doing?
Doing well.
Great.
As always,
do you really want to know? Should I really?
Liz
listen? I want you to be real, Liz. I want you to tell me how you're really feeling. No, but I want to jump in here. I have a lot of energy. I'm sure that was not evident at all, but I'm excited really to get into this conversation because podcasting is such a fun medium and such just like a wide medium at this point. I want to start kind of just by going rapid fire around the room because there was such a podcast boom at one point. I would really love to know from each of you, what was the podcast that either like got you into podcasting that you were like, oh man, podcasts are it. Like this is what I need to be doing, or just like one that you really enjoy. We'll rapid fire it. Becca, I'll start with you.
Well, we started our podcast in 2015, so there weren't a whole lot of options at the time, but I think Adam Carolla was like the heavy hitter and the icon of the time, and I listened to him a lot, and now I love Chelsea Handler.
Excellent. Will, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I remember one of the first ones I was listening to was Brian Koppelman's at the moment. He was early to the game.
Okay. Liz, next to you.
I mean, the one that I like lost my mind over was Serial. That was what I remember as kind of being like, oh, podcasts like can tell a really fascinating story, and you know, and I was just like every week, like the moment it came out, I was like listening to it. Yeah, and I listen to so many now. I really like the New York Times Popcast, where they like really like dissect pop music in a very intellectual way.
Very nice. And Rachel, what was it for you?
I'll probably go with Leon Neyfakh and Slow Burn. Just an incredible storyteller. And the way he can take a story you think you know and flip it on its head. So fascinated by that. Probably followed by Freakonomics. So lots of that, like tell me stuff I don't know, but in an interesting way.
Absolutely. Steve, I'll come to you next. What was the podcast that did it for you?
Well, I'm going right back in the day to when podcasts really first started. So like 04, 05, 06, around that time. And The Guardian in the UK brought out a series with Ricky Gervais, which was a big deal at the time and was just phenomenal. And fun fact, it was a Guardian journalist who coined the word podcast. So that's where it all came from.
Oh,
yeah, England is the first on everything. It's fine.
Not always.
It's fine. We're not bitter about it. I don't want to leave you out, Lee. What was the podcast that did for you?
I agree with Liz. Serial was kind of the one that broke it open for me, and then I loved S-Town. I thought that telling a story that you felt was going in one direction, and then kind of you thought it was a murder mystery, and really just turned into a character piece, I thought was just heartbreaking and lovely. And I remember, yeah, it was the same kind of thing. It's like you're sitting at home, just like kind of leaning by your phone, just waiting for story. It was very unusual, but kind of an incredible experience.
I love the variety on this panel. We call that range, people. Well, Becca, I want to come back to you because as you mentioned, Lady Gang did start back in 2015. And this was kind of like obviously podcasts were around, like you said, but there weren't many. Like this was kind of the pandemic boom of podcasts. What do you remember from the early days of forming Lady Gang? I mean, was there like a risk inherently there in like, I want to start a podcast with two of my good friends? How did that go?
No, we were so early that to get signed with Podcast One, we kind of just had to have a pulse. Like it wasn't as a competitive space. And it was like mind blowing to them that three women wanted to start a podcast. So we did just get the timing for the first time in my whole life was right. And the space has just grown so much since. And thank God we got to like screw up so much when nobody even knew how to use the podcast app that, we're now rocking and rolling, but it wouldn't have been that way had we started later, I don't think.
Well, you've also talked about having something that like you have control over, not in like a domineering, like this is mine sense, but in a sense of like you have autonomy and you guys could do what you wanted to do, especially being early. I mean, what were the challenges there in just kind of figuring out like what you wanted it to be? I imagine at that point you're just sort of like winging it.
My co-host Kelty Knight, she came from an entertainment journalism background, and we structured it out and formatted it like a talk show. So it was like The View or, whatever was on at that time, just because we knew that we couldn't just sit around and talk to each other endlessly and go on tangents and never have, a format that people could go back to and get comfortable with and crave, essentially. So luckily she had the brain and the producer hat to wear to know to do that. But otherwise, we started with celebrity interviews because we thought that that's what would bring people over to the space, which it definitely did, and it definitely helped. But my biggest challenge was getting over, the mockery that was made of me when I was leaving Glee, and all of my cast members were like, "You're gonna what? You're gonna podcast?" And now all of them are doing them, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it was hard to get rid of the stigma for a little bit after coming off of a hit show and starting something so bizarre at the time.
That's neither here or there, but let's make sure that we're clear. She's running a very successful podcast now, Cat, so y'all were wrong. No, but I didn't even think of that there would be a stigma attached to it, but I suppose it wasn't enough at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was kind of it was fine. I mean, I love being underestimated. I think that's sort of the thing that really drives me. And I've waited, what year is it? 2022, this many years to be able to say it. So thank you for having me on TheWrap.
What year is it? It is 2022. I can't promise you that I know what day it is, but I do know it is 2022.
No idea.
Well, Will, I want to come to you next. As a guy on the production side of things, I mean, you have your own production company. Was there like a moment where you knew that podcasts were here to stay? You were like, oh, okay, this medium, like it is taking off and it is going to be a thing.
Yeah, I think once we started seeing kind of more and more platforms like start doing these land grabs of different shows that had like, audience already, I think that once Spotify obviously started making a splash in the space, it was like, okay, Spotify are not dumb people. Like they're looking at this thing as a real viable kind of business trend that they want to really invest into. And so that was, for me, I was like, okay, like we're starting to see it. And then, as these studios started to get more and more interested and more involved, and then you're starting to see, film and TV studios starting to, so it's been this gradual kind of thing. But I think that once you started seeing even like people like, I remember early Will Ferrell like started to say, hey, like I'm going to raise my hand and I'm going to like really do something in this space. Those were all kind of like, they just added to the legitimacy, I think, like to have people who typically are known in other areas of entertainment start like coming over. It was definitely validating for me in those early years.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned all the platforms, right? There's Spotify, there's Apple Music, there's Podcast One, as Becca mentioned. There was a lot. I would be curious for your thoughts on how the state of things are now in terms of availability on platforms, because it kind of feels for some like perhaps that there are maybe 3 like major podcast hosting platforms. Where do you come down on this? Does it feel like there's a lot of room for people to still find a place for themselves?
As a platform,
yeah,
probably it's more and more difficult with every day that kind of happens, because there's so much evolution from day to day and so much growth. And now you have obviously Amazon and Apple, and you're dealing with like serious players that to try to compete is difficult. And that's why you're seeing a company like, for example, Wondery, like joining Amazon because they were already great. And now they have like another serious muscle to that. But I think, platforms right now are starting to really kind of understand, in my opinion, like what they're good at, and then trying to double down kind of in those areas. So you're seeing that, from Audible to Amazon to Apple, like they're starting to see what they can do well, and then it feels like that's where they're moving towards in a fast way.
Very fast. It does feel like it. It's all steaming ahead. Speaking of Audible, Rachel, hi, how are you today? Thanks for being here. I do want to ask you about your thoughts on just kind of the saturation of the pod. Like at this point, my God, everybody has a podcast or everybody wants to do a podcast. It really does feel like, especially in pandemic times, podcasts are everywhere. So what are your thoughts on the saturation of the market? I mean, like, are there too many podcasts at this point, in your opinion?
I don't think there could ever be too many, but I do think as somebody who is thinking about like how do I bring the right content to the right people, people have talked about discovery being one of the critical components of podcasting moving forward, and I think you see more and more of that now. One of the things I really like about podcasting is that there really is something for everybody. But finding that something for you is a really critically important part. And as somebody who's thinking about the types of content, we always start with a customer approach. So understanding really who our customers are, what they want, what they love, and then getting that content to them. That really is the trick that I think we're all thinking about, but doing it in unexpected, creative ways. And that will be something that I do believe we'll continue to see. At Audible, we've really taken a lot of step in that direction. Obviously, we have a lot of consumers who've been listening to audio for 26 odd years. Now we're thinking about how do we program, how do we curate, how do we make sure that they're reaching stuff that we think that would delight them, that they know about or would know about, but also like what is something you should hear that you haven't heard already. And that I think will be continuously a push for us. And I imagine many who are thinking about, the podcast distribution space, it's really about reaching customer.
Well, and I'm curious then, as you're figuring out what to get to these people, how to get them the content that they want. There's a lot of niche audiences and there's a lot of people who may be trying to horn in on like a bigger space. It's just, there's like a lot of factors that go into it. So how do you then kind of determine through all of these pitches that you get, all of these podcasts, it's like, I want to do this. Well, I want to do the same thing from this angle. I mean, how can you really know what is a gem or what might be a hidden gem and what maybe is like, this isn't fully fleshed out enough to be a podcast yet? How do you kind of make those choices?
So the fun thing is that we kind of play in all those spaces. So certainly we are working with a lot of professional people who've been doing podcast content for quite some time, and they can deliver us a project. We know a little bit about what they'll create, their aesthetic. We've worked with them before. We know that they can hit timelines and deadlines. So for those, it's just really reading a pitch and understanding like, what is this? Is this something that we're in the market for? Are we interested in it? Who's pulling it together? But we're also wanting to take risks on creators who maybe haven't worked in the space. And those tend to be a little bit harder where we say, oh, this sounds like a really interesting story, but it is going to come down to the execution of this. And for those, we're kind of working maybe a little more familiar in the traditional Hollywood space, but can we give you a development deal? Can we get you working on it? Can we get you some assistance on the production side? And can we get you moving in that direction and see if we can help you eventually get to one of those areas where we know we're working with somebody who's a pro and has been doing this for a while, similar to an At-Will or someone like that. So there's a lot of space in there, but we have a team of programmers. And so these programmers are thinking about all of the content that we have. They're thinking about our customers, and then they're thinking about where do we see opportunities or where are there things that are coming in that excite us. It's a little bit of art, and a little bit of science and quite a bit of art and figuring out like what's really going to register.
Well, and Steve, I would love for you to expound upon that just on Sony Music side of things. Obviously, you guys have just a plethora of artists on the actual music side of things. Podcasts, obviously, excuse me, words, thing I can do, obviously a little bit different in podcasting. But for Sony Music, I mean, how do you guys kind of comb through what you might want, what might be the next breakout thing? Because there's hidden gems everywhere. So how do you guys find them?
So, I mean, similar to what Rachel was saying, really, I think for us, it is very much about the art as well. I think it's easy to sort of be a bit flippant about audio sometimes because it's a less complicated thing to make than a TV show or a movie. And to think, well, it's sort of easy to turn around, and it's an art in its own form. And so we're always looking for sort of creators who really do understand the medium and understand how to tell a great story in audio and how to explain to the listener. And we talk a lot a phrase we throw around a lot here is sort of a relentless focus on the listener. We're just always thinking about the listener, and am I explaining well enough to the listener sort of what's going on here? So we have a pretty rigorous green light process. And I guess the other thing we have sort of sitting inside of Sony Music is just the business as a whole obviously just has this phenomenal focus on artists and on creative talent. And that's something that's very much been sort of embedded within the podcast team as sort of a thinking to inherit from the wider business. And so that's sort of super important for us as well, whether that's front of mic talent, people who we can empower to sort of tell stories or to, to host a regular show, or obviously behind, producer talent who are phenomenally creative and who need to be nurtured and looked after as well, I think in a similar way to Rachel was describing.
I'd also be curious just in how the process of podcasting has changed. Maybe, since Becca and the Lady Gang happened in 2015 to now 2022, we decided that's what year it is, 7 years later. How has the process or how is the medium rather? Has there been kind of an influx of change as there's been more in the market, or has it been more steady of like, okay, here's what's tried and true, here's what we know works now? I mean, how I guess the best way to phrase that is how steady is the creation process, is the medium?
No, there's a constant flux. I mean, I think probably the biggest change has just been the competition for ideas. Ourselves, Rachel, other folks, we're all in the market, right, for sort of really great ideas and to be obviously in bed with sort of fantastic creators. And we've all seen how that market is heated up in terms of the prices that have to be paid either for weekly ongoing shows, but even, if we're talking with someone like Will, I mean, there's been a number of times, as Will knows, there's shows he's come to us with that we would have loved to have done. And he's gone elsewhere, as is his right to do, because he's spoilt for choice in terms of, the offers that are sort of coming in to great creators. So I think that's been a really intensive thing that's accelerated, I think, especially over, I'd say, the past 3 years or so. And then the other thing is, I think just in the market, it is evolving really rapidly. I mean, when you were talking about saturation, we're nowhere near. In the US, about 50% of the population are listening on a regular basis. So we've got a long way to go still. And that obviously throws open massive opportunities for sections of the audience that actually are undertapped or that aren't getting served properly with the sorts of shows or ideas that they would like. And so I think, we're seeing that evolve sort of fairly quickly now as well.
That surprises me a lot. Only 50% of the country is listening to podcasts at this point. It feels like way more.
Yeah, on a regular basis. I mean, you've got about 108 million Americans who are listening each week, and a good listener is listening to about 8 podcasts a week.
Okay, well, shout out to everyone on this panel. We are all in the upper tier of Americans who are listening to audio content. Yay for us. But I mean, taking audio content, let's take it then to obviously what this panel is about, being a Hollywood goldmine. Liz and Lee, you both work in the television space, and you both took great podcasts and turned them into excellent shows. Liz, I want to come to you first. I mean, how do you know as a showrunner, like what podcast might make a great show? Is it just what you're envisioning as you hear it? Like how do you know that, oh man, this would make a great series to have people watch rather than listen, or not even rather than listen to, but watch after listening to?
No, it's a really good question. I think I think I'm always just looking for my personal connection to it. So it's just about like connecting emotionally to honestly the main character of the podcast, like finding something about it that you just can't stop thinking about. And then I think it obviously helps a lot if the story evolves, if the story really changes and deepens and reveals things to you. And I mean, there's so many amazing podcasts that do that. I think it's looking for like one thread that changes, because a lot of the times I think podcasts also can go in a lot of different directions. And so it's like, I think to tell a, dramatic narrative, you sort of need like one thread that's like moving forward. But yeah, I mean, I think the reason, I don't know, I mean, I feel like Hollywood is gobbling up podcasts because we are lazy, and it's like, it's basically handing you something on a plate, because it's like, here are literal episodes. Like they've already like structured episodes of a story, that and they are also structured in like a bingeable way. So like they're, the podcast producers are trying to like end their episode making you want to watch the next one, which is like exactly what we're doing too. So I think like I'm the next thing I'm doing is also a podcast. So I think I'm
Tell us about that. What's the next thing you're doing, Liz? Let's hear
it's an
about it.
adaptation of Dying for Sex, which is a Wondery podcast that was about a woman who was dying and had a lot of sex, and it's really beautiful.
I love it. I love
Yeah.
It's a very brief log line, but it works. So they got people in there.
Yeah, Lee's gonna star in it. So
yes, Lee, tell us about your next acting role. No, but I do want to come
I'm
to you.
playing dying and dying for sex.
Just dying and dying for sex. Yes. Well, Lee, I was going to come to you next anyway, so that worked out very well. Thank you, Liz, for that beautiful segue. Lee, but I do want to ask. I mean, obviously, you've worked with Wondery, with WeCrashed. I would love to know. There are so many details in a podcast. I know specifically for WeCrashed, you guys went on an extensive hunt for even more details. When you have a podcast coming to you that's pre-made, that's research done, that's here's everything we already know, you can just put it in the series. How do you know then what to not include? I mean, is there anything that you don't include, or do you just say, thank you very much, I will take all of this, and here we go?
You know, you take the underlying material, and then you spend, you know, my writing partner and I, we wrote the pilot over the course of I don't know, like let's say like a month or 6 weeks, and then we wrote a Bible. We wrote a 30-page Bible to get the show greenlit, to get actors and to get the directors on board, and then we hired a writer's room, and we hired the writers for 12 weeks or 16 weeks. Then the writers stopped, and then we did major rewrites of all the scripts. So you don't know exactly what you have until you're kind of in it. And I think what the WeCrashed podcast did so well was it gave this amazing overview, and you started getting a sense of the characters, you started getting a sense of the world, and then we just started diving in, and we hired a researcher. Anne Hathaway had her own researcher. Jared kind of, you know, goes the way that he goes and knew lots of the players and was doing kind of his own research himself. And it just, you start kind of finding like what's the thing that interests you the most in the story. And, you know, as Liz said, it's kind of like accessing the main character. In this story, there were two main characters, and we decided not because we thought it was not truthful, but the thing that kind of made most sense to us was this is actually a love story. Like everyone talks about it as a business story, but it's about these two people who kind of are each other's oxygen, and for better or for worse, they kind of lead each other down these paths. And that was the thing that kind of guided us from episode to episode. And honestly, like looking back on it, I don't even remember how much of the podcast had that or didn't. It gave us kind of that beginning thrust to start dive into those themes.
So you say beginning thrust. So then as you were crafting it, then you didn't necessarily go back as you were writing other episodes, go back and like, oh, let's double check this. Was it just kind of like that jumping off point?
I mean, at the time I listened to the podcast, I loved it. And then all of a sudden we were talking to the subjects ourselves and asking our own questions and like really honing in on the story that we wanted to tell. And by the way, we had no agenda. Like we didn't go into it saying like, oh, we want to take down the Newmans or we want to prop up tech. Like it was just like, we're storytellers. We were fascinated by character and kind of by this moment in time. And so, yeah, I mean, we would go back and listen to the podcast, and we also got like the raw transcripts from the podcast. But like all of a sudden you start talking to people, like I weirdly knew old people that had lived with Adam, people that had been neighbors of him. Like you just start talking to people and you realize the worlds are incredibly small. My dad's Israeli, so I was talking to like Israeli investors that like had come into orbit with him. And so you start kind of collecting material from all of these different places.
Absolutely. Well, and Steve, I want to come back to you because we talk about a lot about that preparation, that like it's coming to you on a platter of here's the things we already know. And I know that Sony is developing more podcasts for television. I mean, at that point, it's just words. Let me find this idea. How much development then takes it from podcast to TV? When you have this research that comes to you, do you say, okay, this is enough? Or when do you say, okay, we need more? What is the process of getting it from podcast to screen?
Well, I think probably, as I'm sure Liz and Lee would say, it very much depends on the producers or the production company that you're working with. I mean, we do find on any shows we're having optioned, there is that initial conversation where the producers want to speak to the audio production team, to the podcast production team, and just see what sort of notes and research there is and how much they can dive into. I think the other thing is it kind of depends on different companies. For us, certainly for the narrative shows that we're telling, we have a subscription channel called The Binge, which sort of does what you'd expect. It's there for sort of bingey shows, and so really that's the lens through which we're commissioning everything that we do. We're saying, does it work for that channel? Now the byproduct of that is that, of course, that makes it that hopefully means we come up with ideas that are super attractive for TV and movies, and then being able to connect that in with the sort of Sony ecosystem in terms of obviously connecting into Sony Pictures Entertainment. We're not sort of we're not required to do the shows we do through Sony in terms of TV and movies. That's just an extra cherry on top, if you like, for us, that we've got cousins who are literally around the corner from our offices in LA on the lot, and we can go and speak with them. But we sort of work with everybody. So I think it really does depend on who you're working with and what's the process they want to do, and also how much do they want to lean on the podcast or not. As Lee said, sometimes it's just a jumping off point. We've definitely had, a couple of shows that we're doing with sort of various different producers where they really are sort of quite tight in with the audio production team to just, dig into a lot of the stuff that didn't actually get covered on the podcast as well.
So it's a lot of moving parts, is what you're saying.
I mean,
There's
when
a lot
I
of
said
pieces at play.
like that it was like handed to us on a platter, I just want to also say that we also work really hard.
Yes, no, I do not mean to insinuate that. Like, thanks for this.
No,
I
said it.
Liz transcribed the podcast and then had actors to say the lines.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because I think the sort of real plus that podcasting has over maybe some of the other spaces where optioning comes out of is that obviously an idea has been thought of in an episodic way,
Yeah.
and you are telling that story, and you've already established a proven audience. Obviously, with both WeCrashed and the Dropout, phenomenal podcasts, fantastic podcasts that had really big audiences. And I think certainly for some companies when they're optioning, that can be quite attractive as well. We're able to share quite a lot of demographic information about who listened to the show as a means of helping the producers to identify who potentially this story could appeal to going forward when it goes onto screen.
And I also think, my personal experience with podcasts is that I get so emotionally involved because it's in my ear, and I don't know, like I think there is, I'm sure it's been said before, but I just feel like as a fan of a podcast, you become like emotionally attached to like the story. I think in a way that you don't reading an article, you're just like flipping through your phone and you read an article, whereas a podcast so I think when there are a lot of listeners of a story, they're not just casual listeners, they're like really enthusiastic listeners who would also watch a show based on, what I mean? Because they're fascinated by the story a lot of the time, I think.
I would also say that the experience of listening to podcasts for me is I'm in my car, I'm by myself, or you're kind of, you're listening to it with your wife or your girlfriend or boyfriend, or whatever. Or you're like taking I don't know, for me, it's like, it's what Liz is saying. When I'm watching TV, I always have my phone in my hand. And so I'm kind of like, I'm doing something else while I'm doing the thing. And when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm only doing that. I don't know, maybe other people do it differently and have it in the background, but like that, I can't concentrate that way. So it feels, I get completely engrossed into it because it's a solitary experience. I'm on an airplane and like, it's all that I'm doing.
And there's a human element to it. You've got a human voice. I mean, it's similar, I would argue, maybe to why people, Rachel, you might be able to speak to this, why people enjoy audiobooks, because it's a person telling you a story rather than your own voice in your head or what you concoct for other people.
Yeah, we've actually done some really interesting stories out of the UK, or research out of the UK, that show just like how different your brain is stimulated when you're watching versus listening versus reading. And if you think about it, it's the one area that's really triggering your imagination because you're not doing those other things at the same time. And then of course you have a much more personal connection to those. Certainly why you can see like certain people who are telling their own autobiographical stories when they're actually reading their stories or telling you those stories, you just feel a little different than when you're reading it. So yeah, it definitely has this like intimate but also human imagination connection to it, and nothing more powerful than the human imagination.
I feel like I want one of those, like, not infographics, but like a GIF version of like how your brain lights up. You know how they do that? It's like, here's your brain thinking about this. I want one of those for when you're listening to audio. That feels really
I want
cool.
one of those too. So maybe that's
Someone
the next
more creative than us. please hear our plea. We want a visual representation of this.
But when you're connected to something like that, it makes sense that you're extra excited about seeing it come to life in a different way. So that makes like an obvious transition when you're really interested in a story or a character that you want more.
I always also like, I'm way more affected by ads on podcasts for some reason. Like I'm just like, the host is like, I wear these underwear, and I'm like, I should wear these underwear. It's like,
that was Becca, wasn't it? Becca wears some great underwear. You heard her say.
I was gonna say
I-
it could have been my voice.
But you're like, I mean, it's like, I know because I also listened to radio when I was a kid all the time. But like when the radio host was like, check this out. So it's not new, but I do feel like you just feel like those people are your friends in a way. It reminds me of like, because I did New Girl for a long time, and there's that long running sitcom kind of feeling of like, oh, they're my friends, I'm hanging out with them. And it's like, I feel like when you listen to a podcast, you feel personally like you're hanging out with people.
Well, I would be curious, Will, from your perspective as the guy who produces these, how do you kind of ensure that comes through? How do you ensure that there is that human connection? And like when you listen to something, you're like, oh man, people are really going to tune into this. Like, how do you make sure that that's there?
I think it's about like whoever you're hearing from, really making them feel as like organic as possible. I think especially because now podcasts have evolved so much, it's like listeners are smarter and they can see through when something feels forced, or they can see through when someone feels like they're just reading from a script. Like, so part of like our work is making sure that whoever's delivering these words is doing it in a way that really feels comfortable and personal and, like I said, organic, authentic, all these buzzwords. But the reality is, if you feel like you're hearing it from someone who A, is passionate, and B, like who's really close to this thing, and C, is feeling like kind of your friend, or like you're discovering something along with them, like that's one thing that we really try to do a lot. That feels like the most successful shows that we've had.
Absolutely. Well, Becca, I want to come to you because as we talk about these audiences and finding those people that want what you're putting out, what I love about Lady Gang is that it's not about one thing. It's not a true crime podcast. It's not like a show specifically dedicated to following another show that's on. It's not a companion podcast. You guys talk about what you want to talk about. You talk about your lives, and you've really, and I know this, the Lady Gang community is huge. I mean, my God, you're on tour right now because the Lady Gang community is so huge. So how is it kind of crafting that? What was it when you guys were setting out to create Lady Gang? Was that kind of something you wanted in your mind of like, we just want to create a community of women? How did you approach that?
A little bit. I mean, it was 2015 again. I'm like a broken record, but the whole like authenticity and unfiltered thing wasn't so buzzy, and everybody it was crazy. I told like some really gross intimate stories about dirty underwear on the podcast, and that's because I just myself in life have no filter. I was sick of all the like weird media training that you did when you're on a TV show on a network, and I was like leaving these interactions feeling like this weird robot pageant girl. And so this podcast was just sort of my way of selfishly having my moment to just shoot the shit with my friends. But also we were kind of finding that as an adult woman who's career driven, or even if you're really family oriented, with your nuclear family, it's really hard to connect with adult women. It's hard to make new friends as an adult, and sometimes you're just too lazy to do it.
Yes.
And you're too busy, but you still want that time to, we have crazy things like light up in our brains as women when we sit around and just talk about life and stuff happening to us, and yes, sometimes gossip. Like, it's just how we are built, and chemically it feels really good to do that. So the community organically started to pop up because women just didn't have time to go sit with their friends for 3 hours at brunch, but they could tune in for 45 minutes and hear about our opinion of whatever was happening in the world. So yeah, the community element of it was just sort of like filling this gap that we felt was there for adult women in general.
Well, I agree with you. It is hard to make friends as an adult. Emily and I talk about this on our podcast for Rap Women all the time. We're like, you're set in your ways. It's hard. So I get it. I get where you were going with that. I also want to ask, I mean, Lady Gang, it was briefly in the television medium. You guys did go to E for a little bit. I believe it was one season. And then you guys went back to audio, and now you guys have 2 books out. Talk to me about the journey of going to TV and then realizing or thinking, maybe this doesn't work for us.
Yeah, I think we got really spoiled for a couple years. We were our own bosses. We didn't have a lot of input from Podcast One. They sort of just saw what we were doing was working and just allowed us to continue on that trajectory. So then you go to a big network and people are stressed and they want viewers. And not everybody that listens to the podcast is going to come over and watch you on TV. And certainly not at I think we were 11 o'clock on a Sunday. And so that plays a really big part in your success, as everybody here knows. And, it just felt like we are so grateful that platform it built our audience. We grew our audience from that TV show, but ultimately it wasn't the Lady Gang. What was on that TV show? It wasn't the Lady Gang. It was like a Lady Gang with a sprinkle of, what NBC wanted and what E wanted and what the focus groups wanted, which was essentially not the 3 of us, because they kept looking at 3 women in their 30s without children and screaming that we were so unrelatable. So that was
It's almost like TV doesn't really work.
It's weird, right?
The development process is flawed. I don't know.
Yeah. It was I had so much empathy after that for all the creative team on shows that I've worked on. I will say that, because I was like, oh, you guys were fighting so many battles that I had no idea, as just this dumb actress that showed up in satin hair and makeup, didn't realize. So it was an amazing learning experience. I got to be an executive producer on something. I got to employ a million women and just really talented women. But beyond that, it just, sometimes you can't make something work just because it worked as a podcast. And it's a testament to, obviously, the Dropout and WeCrashed. It's something that you were able to take something really popular on a podcast and make it even more popular in television. So mazel tov.
Well, I mean, I think it's obviously different, it's different. It's a story that exists, whereas
yeah.
Different mediums, for sure. Well, and Will, I want to come to you then, because with your production company, at Will Media, you work with scripted and non-scripted content. You create a whole bunch of different shows. I'd be curious for your perspective on, is it harder to kind of break through podcasting, TV, whatever, with maybe scripted content versus a talk format like Becca had? What do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Liz said something like this earlier. You're literally giving someone an example of what this thing could be on a platter, and so with fiction scripted, and Audible's, one of our main partners for that type of content, it's like you're really putting together the TV show. You're casting the actors, you have a director, you have, a showrunner, and it's a mini version of a series. And so when you're doing that, you can work out a lot of kinks in that kind of period, so that when you get to, okay, we're launching this and we're having talks about the adaptation for TV, it's like, look, we tried this is why it didn't work. There's a lot of case study already there. And then you get to the thing, it's like, we also have actors that played it. This person didn't work for it because of this reason, but here's who I think would, so there's a lot of that. But it's really exciting that format specifically is starting to really take off and become this great kind of, like I said, sample for a showrunner to look at and say, wow, I see how I could do this visually because of how well it's done in your ears.
I'm glad that you bring up working with Audible, because I want to ask you and Rachel both about this, as I was doing some wonderful, exciting research on this, because you are all so fascinating. There is a very exciting project coming to Audible. It is called Breakthrough, the first ever singing competition launched as a podcast. This feels wild to me. I don't know how this is going to, I have full faith that you're going to make it work, but it feels absolutely insane. So Rachel, I would love for you, does it feel risky? Is it just kind of an exciting? Is it both? I mean, how do you reach a point where you're like, you know what, let's try something completely new?
I'm very excited to hear Rachel's answer right now, by the way.
It's all those things and more. When we heard about this, it was one of those things where everybody was just like, yeah, I want to do that. I want to see what that is. I want to see how we do that. And then since then, it's been piecing together, well, how do you actually do that? So certainly, I think it's one of those things where you you want to extend what the format can be. You want to figure out how can you draw in different types of connections? How can you just create content in a different way and leverage the medium? I'm pretty excited to see, like, how do you do a competition like this when you are removing some of the visual elements of it, and it really comes down to the craft, like somebody actually singing, and is that delightful? And how do we bring in the fans and the people listening as part of that experience? So it was big. It is ambitious. It is risky, but it's very exciting. And I'm personally also very excited to see how this all comes together.
Is it too late to audition, or is it?
We can get you in.
I can't sing a lick, but I would love to audition as well. I think Becca might be the only one. I don't know. Lee, maybe you have some golden pipes that we don't know about. Can you sing, Steve? I don't know.
Definitely not.
I was just going to say, I thought I could, and then I auditioned in college for a cappella because I went to a school where the a cappella guys were very cool. And then I performed the theme song to The Love Boat as my audition song, and I didn't get in.
And then
so, yes, I do
Perfect
have golden pipes.
I get it. So you were the inspiration for Pitch Perfect is what happened.
Correct, yes.
If I audition, it'll be the death knell of the show, so they definitely don't want me singing on it.
Well, yes, we definitely want it to succeed, as it is something so new. But I mean, Becca, I'm just saying, you can sing. And
Becca, we would love you to audition.
Right now?
Yeah, right now.
Just do a little
This
something.
is how we
Give
did
it to
it.
the people.
No, but just on that too, with Rachel, like what Rachel was saying, it almost seems obvious, right? Like we know this format kind of works, and we know that people listen to music and podcasts in their ears. When we bring these things together, it actually, considering the intimacy, it actually creates this experience that is unlike what you're watching on TV in a really positive way. And we're super excited to bring that.
I actually think, Andy, it plays to a wider point. I think it's phenomenal what Rachel and Will are doing, and it plays to a wider point, which is creatively, there's still a long way for us to go in podcasting.
Yeah.
And we talk internally a lot actually about looking at TV and some of the formats and different ideas that have worked on TV, because we've really only barely touched the surface, particularly when you think about the entertainment shows that have been much more host-driven shows, like Lady Gang, shows of groups of people coming together and speaking to a community. From a format perspective, there's a long way for us to go still.
Absolutely. And this is unscripted, obviously. So because like you said, Steve, we are very much at a point where it's been scripted content. Lee, Liz, you guys know it was all scripted content. I mean, as we kind of wrap up our time here, I do want to come back to kind of the overarching theme here of podcasts being a Hollywood goldmine. Lee, does it feel that way to you? Does it feel like podcasts might be the next thing to start pulling from, that like this really is, future, not maybe the future of TV, but a future of TV?
Well, it's definitely a future of TV. I mean, people love to be entertained. People love stories. And as storytellers, if you can't come up with your own stuff, you kind of, right? Like you take what you put your spin on it, but you take a story that excites you and that you feel passionate about and that you feel like you have something to say that you can add to that. It's really exciting. I mean, since WeCrashed, I've been getting sent a lot of podcasts from all the different places, and some things work best as a podcast. They work best as a 5-hour audio experience, and some things feel hyper visual, and you're just trying to find what kind of makes the most sense to you. But yeah, I mean, it's having any other outlets that generate IP, I think, is really important and special.
So if I wanted
also, like, I think, sorry to jump
Go
in,
for
but
it, yeah.
I think also, like, I think with more limited series, I think viewers like to do deep dives on stories in a way that feels a little different than a movie, obviously. Like, so I feel like there's more appetite for a like long story that has a lot of angles and tangents and things like that. I feel like it's not the future. It's like, it is the present. Honestly, I feel like that there's so, like, I mean, it just seems like it's already happening. There's so much podcast crossover. Maybe it's just my life.
Well, Liz, you were like, sorry for jumping in. I was just going to make a terrible joke. So please, by all means, always feel free to jump in and cut me off. Unfortunately, though, that is our time. Guys, thank you so very, very much for being on this panel. Guys who are listening, I mean, listen, we've got Dying for Sex coming. We've got a singing competition coming via podcast. We've got the Lady Gang out and going strong. They are on tour because they've got a second book out, and Audible and Sony Music have some incredible things in development. So please just be on the lookout for all this content. I want to thank you, Becca, Will, Liz, Rachel, Steve, Lee. Thank you so very much for joining us at The Grill, presented by Wrap Pro. And to those of you watching, please check out more at The Grill, because you get conversations like this, and then your day is just better. Your life is just better. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.